Hi everyone, welcome to lesson number 9, free lesson number 9. This week it's going to be on English GCSE. It's going to be taken by Hannah here. She did one a couple of weeks ago, so if you've seen that, enjoy. And she's back again. She's going to be running through AQA paper 2, question 5 this time. So over to you, Hannah.
Lovely, thank you very much. Yes, hello. So I'll be going through, as James said, language paper 2, question 5. It is that big question, that 40-mark question at the end of paper 2. Paper 2 tends to be everyone's least favourite paper because there are 2 extracts to look at, and it tends to confuse a few people. So hopefully question 5 is somewhere we can boost lots of marks, because there's lots of things that we can do to impress the examiners a little bit. So yes, language paper 2, question 5. So what's the point of the question? Well, it's to produce a consciously crafted article in which you clearly and effectively convey your point of view. Now, this year's Year 11s, the 2022 cohort of students, are quite, well, unlucky in many ways with all the disruption that they've had, but lucky in the way that AQA have actually told them that you are going to be writing an article. If you're watching and you're in Year 10, you're probably not going to have that lovely bit of information as well. But it's always good to know what articles should look like and what they should include. So lots of this is going to be aimed at writing an article, because I'm thinking of the Year 11s who've got their exams very, very soon. Yes, consciously crafted, that just means everything you write needs to be very much on purpose. That sounds obvious, but it just means you need to put things together thoughtfully. So consciously, thoughtfully, putting your ideas together in a way that makes sense and a way that is engaging and interesting for your reader. You've got to remember these examiners are marking like 300 of these questions or something ridiculous. Yours has got to be interesting. You've got to engage them, help them out a little bit. 300 of them, that's a lot. So you need to demonstrate your ability to use a range of language and structural devices to fit your purpose and appeal to your audience. So it's just got to be interesting. That's the main thing. It's got to be interesting and believable as well. There's a little bit of acting involved in this one, really. So today I'm going to be going through the question, breaking it down a bit, what are you expected to do? So we'll be recapping those essential elements and kind of going through some ways that you might be able to boost those marks, so some tips for success. I'm also going to give you a few examples that I've kind of highlighted and broken down where those examples would get credit. So what has been done in those models that would get that person some marks, that person being me in this case. So lots of students call this something different. Lots of teachers call this something different. I call it the gap because it's just catchy. I got to identify the gap. So when you get your question, you are going to be given a statement and then a bit of information. You've got to establish what the genre, audience, and the purpose are for your task. The genre is what you are writing. So today we're focusing on articles, but you might be asked to write a speech or a letter or something like that. The audience, that is who you are writing for. So you want to be as specific as possible. So if you are writing an article for your school magazine, that is for your fellow students. So what you are writing has got to appeal to them. So you're going to use examples that they will understand and that they will find interesting. So you might make a reference to some kind of popular culture person who your fellow classmates might engage with. And your purpose, that's why you are writing. So that is to argue or persuade, most likely. So it's essential to consider those, because what you write and how you write it is going to be completely different depending on your task that you're focusing on. So the genre, like I said, today I'm focusing on articles. So in an article, the ones with the asterisks next to them, so the ones with this, they are the ones that are the most important when it comes to writing an article. So a clear, appropriate headline. You've got to grab your reader's attention. You want that headline to be short, snappy, and to tell us what you are going to be talking about in your article. It can also hint as well about what your opinion is. Strapline, again, it's not essential. Subheadings, not essential, but can be very, very helpful. So, for example, your subheadings can get you marks for structure if you use them well enough. So, for example, I read a fantastic question 5 last year where the student had used subheadings as questions. So they said, why shouldn't we be doing this? And then they've answered that question underneath that subheading. So they've introduced their paragraph with a question, and they've answered that question within the paragraph. So that's a good way of using subheadings. A clear overview paragraph to start, so that's your introduction, and an effective and concise conclusion. Those last two we will be looking at a little bit later with some examples of how to do those things. So, yes, if you're writing an article, you shouldn't mention the statement. So in this question, you'll get given something. So, for example, the statement we're going to be looking at today is to do with sport. So the sport will be kind of like just a quote, but that is a starting point. That's to get your thoughts going. That is not something you should reference. You wouldn't pick up a newspaper or go online and read an article, and the first line you read, it won't be, I agree with the statement that. That sounds like you're a student answering a statement or replying to a statement, and you're not supposed to be a student responding to a statement in this question. You're supposed to be acting like an article writer or whoever you are supposed to be writing this article. So we want to avoid saying things like, I agree with the statement, or I agree, or that kind of stuff. That is much better saved for paper 1 question 4, which will give you a statement which you have to reply to. So your audience, this is our question for today that I'm going to be using as an example. So all sport should be fun, fair, and open to everyone. These days, sport seems to be more about money, corruption, and winning at any cost. Write an article for a newspaper in which you explain your point of view on this statement. So I chose this one because I thought it was more of a challenge. I don't know much about sport. There is one sport that I know about that I'll be using as an example a little bit later on. Apart from that, I don't know much. So I thought it'd be more of a challenge for me to show you how to plan a response to a question like this. So the audience, you've been told what you're writing. It's an article in a newspaper. So you know that newspapers, it's likely to be older teens or above. So it's most likely going to be older adults that you're writing for. Specifically, older adults who are interested in sport, because that is a topic. So everything you write needs to be for that group of people. So if it's older adults, you're not going to be talking about things that adults don't understand. No kind of, I'm going to sound really old now, talking about TikTokers and all that kind of stuff. So because the older adults aren't going to know or care about that kind of stuff. You need to tailor it to them. So how might you adapt this approach to suit this audience? Well, that's what I've already talked about, really. This idea that you've got to use examples that will appeal to them. You've got to use specific examples that you can think of maybe from the news or that you've made up but sound believable to make your points. Again, I'll give examples of these later on. I should also say, because this is such a big question, I'm just going through all the advice. Obviously, if you're watching this back on YouTube, then you can just pause it and that kind of stuff. So I apologise if I'm whizzing through or if you're trying to make notes and your hand's about to fall off. So your purpose. If you are arguing, you're expressing your point of view. So you are going to be using things like rhetorical questions, expert opinions, repetition, anecdotes, emotive language, all those kinds of things which can be very, very helpful. But this is something we shouldn't forget. So feel free to use some imagery and some metaphors. It makes your writing sound so much more interesting. We tend to think that these belong in paper 1, question 5, which is descriptive writing or narrative writing, but they absolutely belong here as well. So use some imagery to engage your reader. So arguments should be balanced in tone. So they're not going to be sounding very, very argumentative and aggressive. They're balanced in tone, but not in content. So what you write should make your opinion clear. So we don't want you to flip-flop. We don't want one paragraph saying, this opinion. On the other hand, this is the opposite opinion. This is this opinion. This is the opposite. We don't want that. We want your opinion to be clear. So you can address counter-arguments, but then you're going to deconstruct them. So if you're being kind of polite and balanced about it, because you're arguing, not persuading, you are going to deconstruct any kind of counter argument. So if you're not sure, a counter argument is just the opposite opinion of what you're saying. So how could you do that? Well, so this is an example paragraph where you might consider how you might deconstruct that kind of counter argument. So I understand that many would argue that women's football simply doesn't get the viewership to warrant higher pay for players. However, giving more airtime to women's football would lead to more publicity, which in turn increases the money poured into the sport, allowing for our most talented female players to earn the wages they deserve. It seems silly to point that out in 2022. So there are things here that I've done to deconstruct, not smash down the counter argument. Because remember, arguing is about being polite but firm. You're saying, here is my opinion, it's correct, I think you should agree with me. So by saying things like, I understand, you sound very reasonable, like you are listening to the other side, but then you might use a nice polite connective like however. You say, actually, this is correct. I've also then used words like would. So this would lead. So that makes me sound confident. I know what I'm talking about. To, again, sound believable and convincing. And then that final bit, on the next slide, I've shown you where I would get credit for this part of my answer. And that last bit I've called gentle guilt tripping, because that's what you're doing. You want people reading who don't agree with you to feel a little bit guilty and just maybe think, oh, maybe I should agree with them. So it's a language device. So I'd get marks for judicious vocabulary choices. That means I've chosen my words carefully. There's nothing really fancy in there, no really fancy, strange words or anything. Maybe warrant, which means to kind of deserve, is the most fancy kind of word we've got there. But you don't get marks for fancy language. You get marks for choosing your words carefully. So words, for example, like poured into the sport. So poured is, again, it's a bit like an image. You can imagine lots of money being given to the sport to boost the reputation of women's football. I've also used discourse markers. Discourse markers are like little signposts, things like however. It shows that your work is moving forward, that it's moving along. You're not just making lots of statements, you're moving things along at a good pace. There are a range of sentence structures there, so you can see a few commas, which I use accurately, so I get marks for accurate punctuation. I've dealt with a counter argument by saying I understand it, but this is why I disagree. And I've gently guilt tripped them by saying, it's silly to have to point out that in 2022, why don't we have more equality? So you're kind of giving your reader a chance to think, oh yes, I agree. I don't want to be the person who seems mean by not agreeing. So again, gentle, polite way of going about things. Persuade is a bit more fun because it's a bit more forceful. So you are going to be using lots of similar techniques, and again, hopefully using some imagery and some metaphors. But the main difference is you are going to be more forceful, and you are going to address the counter arguments, and you're going to absolutely demolish them. You are going to smash them. So you're not going to deconstruct them. You are absolutely going to say, I'm correct, you're wrong, this is why. So much more forceful. So again, the one sport I know about is Formula One. So that's the example that I've used. I've used an example from Formula One. You obviously might not have an understanding of what you're asked about. You might not know much about it at all. So you can make up examples as long as they sound believable. Again, we'll touch on that a bit later. But if you do have examples, use what you know because it sounds more convincing. So if you do have an example that you can draw on to use in your argument, then absolutely you should. So in case you don't know, there was a lot of controversy at the end of last year with Formula One. There was a controversial decision that was made and made a lot of people very upset. So that's what I'm talking about here. So I understand that sport is about competition. It's about the exhilaration that comes with competing or simply supporting your favourite sports person or team. But surely morality and fairness are important too. Consider the disaster of the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix last year. The race was thrilling, but as happens in racing, there was an incident which meant the race was likely to end with a rather anticlimactical safety car. This would have been an anticlimax, of course, but it would have been fair. With one decision, the race director prioritised publicity, abandoned the rules, and with them, the integrity of the sport. Now, you don't need to know the ins and outs, the details of what actually happened to see that the kind of language I'm using is much more forceful than I was using before. So I've still started with I understand. So I'll just go back one actually. So I've still started with I understand. So it sounds like I'm going to be reasonable. It sounds like I have thought about the other side. But I've said things like surely, which again makes it sound like I'm confident. I can't possibly conceive that anyone would want to agree with the other side of the argument. I've used words like disaster, abandoned, which are quite over the top and dramatic. I've also got things like integrity. So that's the idea of kind of sticking to your principles and being correct. And that's quite an emotional and emotive thing to refer to kind of talk about people's morals. No one wants to be seen as a bad person. And so I'm kind of playing into that and trying to encourage people to agree with me, which, according to this, will make them a better person. So where would I get some marks? Again, I've chosen my words very carefully. Words like integrity, words like disaster, things like that. I've chosen my words really carefully. But disaster isn't a very fancy word, again, but it's specific. Language devices like rhetorical questions and emotive language. Again, I've mentioned things like morality and fairness. I've got a rhetorical question. So surely morality and fairness are important too. I've got lots of discourse markers. So again, things showing that my work is moving forward. I've got a range of sentence structures. I've got accurate punctuation, and my counter argument is dealt with effectively, forcefully. It's important to bear in mind with punctuation. So just because of time today, I'm not going to be able to explain exactly how you use commas, full stops, all that kind of stuff perfectly. It's very easy to research though, and to practice using. It's important to bear in mind it's much more important to use the basics accurately than to show off with loads of semicolons and colons and hyphens and things like that. If you are getting your full stops, commas, capital letters, apostrophes, all correct, things like that, then you can still get some really nice marks if you are using them consistently, accurately. So, if the question says explain your point of view, technically it is asking for you to argue, so to be balanced. But it's not a bad thing to get a bit more forceful at times. So even if it says explain your point of view and you've been arguing, it's okay to be a little bit more pushy in places. You've got to sound like you really care about what you're writing about, and sometimes that will mean you get a bit more dramatic, and that's fine. It's also important to bear in mind as well, AQA want to give you marks. It might not feel like that all the time, but they do. They want to reward you. So even if you read explain your point of view and you persuaded rather than argued, you would still get credit for what you've achieved and what you've included in your work. So the best place to get a bit more forceful is your conclusion. We will come back to conclusions a bit later, and I'll show you an example of getting nice and emotional in your conclusions. So one of the big complaints with this question is students saying, I don't know what to write. How do I know what to write? The statement is there to help you. My students often find it very helpful if they break down the statement that they are given and actually look really closely at the different parts and what they give you already. So if you look, just that one statement can be broken down into 6 different points. So all sport should be fun, fair, and open to everyone. So already, if I wanted, I could work through those in different points. So my first paragraph could be all about how sport should be fun. My next paragraph could be all about how sport could be fair, how it should be open to everyone. Those two are quite similar. Maybe I'll talk about those in one. Then I could talk about money, then corruption. Corruption means kind of things that are unfair, or people being unfairly rewarded, or things like that. It's about being unfair, and people kind of abusing powers. That's what corruption means. So how could I use these as part of my plan? I need to think about my opinion. This is all about your opinion. You are writing an opinion piece. So do you agree with some of them? Do you agree with not all of them? So you don't have to agree with all of them. Which ones are you going to focus on? Because there are 6 there. You might not write 6 paragraphs. You might write 4. So which ones are you going to focus on first? Remember to always start with your best one, because then at least you've definitely got time to write it and make sure you've got enough time to do it well. So you might not have time to cover them all, but you should cover a few of them in each half of the statement, just to make sure that you are showing the examiner you are dealing with the whole task. So by that I mean, well, maybe I'll just focus on this one and then these 2. Because then I've got some from the green section, the first half, and then I've got some from the blue down the bottom. So again, if you're coming back to this video, you could look at this, pause it. You could write down the ones that you want to focus on and note down your general opinion, and that will start to form a plan. AQA every single year, so the best question 5s are planned. They look at your work and they see a plan, and they see that the student has consciously, thoughtfully tried to craft, put things together carefully, their piece of writing. And they always sound better because people don't repeat themselves, they don't go around in circles, everything fits together beautifully, everything comes together. So always leave some time to plan. Maybe about 7 minutes, 5 to 7 minutes of planning, just jotting down your ideas. So your argument should be traceable throughout. So can it evolve, for example? By your argument, I mean your main opinion. So your overall opinion, I should be able to track it all the way through. I should see that in your introduction you say one thing, and if I go through every single paragraph, does it all match up with what you started with? Does everything kind of fit together? In your plan, make brief notes and divide them up by paragraph, a bit like I have here. Imagine that those numbers are paragraphs instead. You don't need to put which techniques you'll include in each paragraph, because then you end up tick boxing, and sometimes you might force certain techniques in and they don't really fit. So you might mention, for example, maybe an extended metaphor. So in the first paragraph, you might use a certain image that you think is quite good and you like it, and you might try and extend it or reference it in every paragraph. So maybe you're talking about freedom, maybe you talk about birds or use an image of a bird, and then in the next paragraph you might get another reference to a bird. That would get you marks not just for language but for structure, because everything is traceable. All of your ideas are fitting together and being linked by that technique. So have you got any structural points to remember that you should write in your plan? So for example, trying out a headline, or is there a phrase that you'd like to repeat? Think about some of the most successful speeches or pieces of persuasive writing that have ever been produced. I have a dream, I have a dream, I have a dream. It's repeated, it's catchy. There's a reason why repetition is used so often in speeches, and it's because it is very effective. So do you need to make a note of any repeated phrases that you'd like to use throughout your work, maybe in the final line of each paragraph? You can also use the discussion clock. I love the discussion clock. It is so, so helpful for thinking of ideas. So what this will do is help you think about your topic from lots of different points of view, or from lots of different kind of approaches. So not every heading will suit every task. So some of them just won't fit. So you don't need to memorize every heading, but if you were to use this as part of your revision, maybe pick 4 or 5 that you could memorize as best you can, and use those as prompts for your plan as well. So for example, you can use it like this. If you look at some of those things around there, so we've got psychological, religious, scientific, all of those are different approaches. How do I match it to this one, this task? Well, sport seems to be about winning at any cost. I've put, so that's part of the statement I was given. I've said, I agree. And I've said that that could be something I consider from a moral standpoint. Should it be about winning at all costs? Is that what sport is about? So it's about our sense of right and wrong, moral. Another part of the statement says sport seems to be all about corruption. Sorry if you could hear the ice cream man going past. Sport seems to be all about corruption. And I've put agree because I feel like being dramatic. I've put I agree, and it could be political because if it's about corruption, it's about power. So who's in control? Are they abusing that power? Are they getting what they want and what other people don't want? So that is an approach that I could go from. And my argument could be about the politics that are linked to corruption. Again, it totally depends on you. If you don't feel comfortable talking about a political point of view, then you wouldn't. You'd talk about a different thing from the discussion clock, or you'd talk about a different part of the statement. It is about you choosing what you feel will help you show off the most, because that is what question 5 is all about. It is showing off how you can come up with ideas, how you can come up with an opinion, and how you can express it in an interesting, engaging way. So just some tips for success now. These are just things to bear in mind. Again, if you come back to the video, you can pause it and you can have a look at some of them, some of the examples that are given. So it's really important that your voice is clear. So you need to sound like a real person. You need to sound like you. The reason is you don't want it to sound like a robot. You know, we want it to sound like you, want it to be engaging and interesting. So you can show off your personality in your work. So again, imagery, simile, metaphor, all of those things show off your creativity. If you're funny, be funny. If you're sarcastic, be sarcastic. Because the examiner, if you're clear enough, they will appreciate you sounding like an individual. You have got to sound like you care. You've got to try and show off some passion, even if you don't care. You couldn't care less about the statement that you're given. You've got to imagine that you're writing this article, that you have chosen to write this article because you care about the topic. So you've got to fake it, basically. You've got to fake this passion. So you've also got to sound believable. So you don't want to say that 100% of people in the country agree that sport should be fun. How do you know? Have you conducted a survey and 100% of everyone in the entire country, you've knocked on every door in the country and you've found that? Of course not. It needs to be convincing, believable. So facts and statistics can be very helpful for that, but they can be very distracting if they are misused. So avoid mentioning individuals like doctors, because then students often end up creating these strange characters. I read one recently that had a Dr. Wahlberg and a Dr. The Rock as well. The Rock, it was The Rock. It's distracting. You want it to sound believable. So these are some sentence starters that you could use to sound a bit more believable when it comes to studies. So not individuals, but we look at studies. So you can say things like countless studies have shown, or you can give a bit more detail that sounds believable. So a 2013 study conducted by the University of Lancaster found that out of 250 participants, 20% had. It just sounds believable because I've got a year, I've got a place, I've got a number of people who did it, and I've got a percentage. It sounds really believable. Again, if you don't feel confident giving that kind of level of detail, use it to things like this, which just sound convincing, but they're more subtle. So we've also found that the most successful ones, the most interesting, the most cohesive, the ones that fit together nicely, connect paragraphs together. So, for example, if the end of my paragraph that I read out before said, abandon the rules and with them the integrity of the sport, my next paragraph might start, it is not just the integrity of the sport that is at risk, but the support of the fans. So I've mentioned what I talked about before, but now I've introduced my next argument as well. So I've referenced the previous paragraph and I'm starting my new point. So that links to this idea of your work having to flow together nicely. So we've got lots of discourse markers that we need to be using, and also linking those paragraphs together to show that things fit. So I've got some examples underneath there as well of some of the discourse markers you might be wanting to use. This is really important because lots of students have the statement and they think, right, now it's the time, I'm going to have a nice rant. I'm going to be against this statement and I'm just going to go for it. And they just list their grievances or they list the problems with the statement. And it's not a time for that. You've got to be solutions focused. What's the point of complaining if we can't do anything about it? So I've got an example just here. For example, if you argue that there are fewer females who are interested in a career in sport, explain how we might encourage them to get involved by developing publicity campaigns or funding school sport programs. So I've said, yes, there are fewer females in sport, but this is what we can do. I often think of there's an example, a past paper that talks about snow, and it asks students to explain their point of view on snow being dangerous. And lots of students argue like they want to ban snow. That's not an option. We can't do that. It's impossible. So how can we be safer in the snow? If it's dangerous, tell me what I can do about it. And that's what you've got to do. So in each of your paragraphs, see, have I just complained? Can I give a solution or an option or an idea to make it better? So your introduction, it's really, really important. It's one of the most important things you're going to be writing in your article. And that's what it should do. It should grab attention, establish your argument. So your opinion should be clear. It should set the tone nice and clearly. And it should set the standard as well. It's like a taster for the examiner. You're in for a treat. Get ready because I'm about to write something amazing. You can also use anecdotes really nicely in your introduction. So I'll show you an example of an anecdote that you might, a style of anecdote you might use. So again, this is linking to this task here about sport. I did not like PE when I was at school. I hated carrying my kit around. I hated the stench of the changing rooms. I hated the convoluted rules. I hated the scuffed knees. I hated how my legs would turn purple during outdoor lessons in the winter. I loathed it. But what I loathed the most came in year 9, when I learned that girls were no longer allowed to play rugby. This information infuriated me. Not because I wouldn't get to play, I haven't touched a rugby ball since I was 13, but because it was a clear message to all the female students at my school. This sport isn't for you, whether you like it or not. So what I've done here is established a personal connection to the statement. I've established a reason for writing about it. Again, if I'm imagining that I'm a writer, a real writer, writing an article in a newspaper, there must be a reason I'm writing that article. I want to express my point of view. So I'm making it clear what my personal connection is to this topic. And in this case, this idea of hating PE, but wanting a sense of fairness as well. So where would I get my marks? So even as it's just my introduction, I'm already getting credit for all of these things. These are just the first part of my assessment, and this is what I'm getting marks for. So a variety of sentence structures. So I start off with a simple statement. I did not like PE when I was at school. And then I've got a very long list that follows. So I've got a variety of sentence structures. I've got judicious vocabulary choices. I've chosen my words really carefully. Words like loathed, which means hate, infuriated, to be made furious. Again, they're not fancy words, but they are very, very specific in their meaning. I've also used language devices like listing. There's a very long list here, just to emphasize how much I hated PE at school. I've also got things like repetition, and the whole thing is an anecdote. It's a personal story, an anecdote. I've got a range of punctuation because I've got some brackets in there. I've got my apostrophe. I've got commas. And my argument is really clear and my point of view. I don't like sport, but I don't like it when it's not fair, even more. So all of that is very clear. I'm already getting marks for it. So what about a conclusion? So they are your final thoughts and a summary of your argument. Ideally, it should link back to the start. So I will give you an example of what I mean by that shortly. So it should link back to the start if you can, bringing everything back round. It makes everything feel finished and complete. Question 5, it is essential that you finish. If you don't finish, it's not like a real article. It won't feel convincing. You have to set that time apart to finish it. I'd recommend doing question 5 first, by the way. You are fresher. You are thinking about SPAG a little bit more, spelling, punctuation, and grammar. It's 45 minutes for this question. Spend the full 45 minutes writing and finishing. So hopefully you get to show off in your conclusion. So it should linger in the reader's mind as much as possible. So I know it's idealistic to wish for a sport to be completely fair and open to all, but why shouldn't we at least aim to make this happen? Why shouldn't we try to tackle corruption and greed? Why shouldn't we make sport more appealing to more people? Each generation of the human race has always striven to grow and be better than the generations that came before them, and I believe that improving equality, accessibility, and morality in the sporting world is one way we can keep pushing for progress. I'll fight for this for the Year 9 girls who were denied rugby at school. I'll fight for this because I believe humans deserve fairness. If you believe that we can be better as a generation, and if you love sport, then I think you should fight too. So I've got my reference to those Year 9 girls who I referenced in my introduction, and that links everything back to the beginning. So I'm kind of rounding everything off nicely. It's like a little bow, tying it up. Your question 5 is a present for the examiner. I've also got lots of language devices, so I'm getting marks here as well. So again, sentence structures, because I've got things like questions. I've got careful, judicious vocabulary choices. Words like equality that are quite emotive, make people care. I've got language devices. I've got a fancy one called Anaphora. Anaphora is where you repeat the phrases at the beginning of a sentence, or repeat words at the beginning of different phrases. So I'll fight, I'll fight. I've also got inclusive language, this idea that if you believe, then I think you should fight. So I'm talking directly to my reader to say, come on, get involved. Again, my argument is clear and my point of view is clear. So I've ended on this idea of involving people and encouraging people to get involved because I care and I want the reader to care too. So the final thing, after you've written your conclusion, you've got to proofread. Never think this is a waste of time. Lots of students, I think, panic if they're not writing, then they're wasting time. Not at all. Proofreading is where you can make sure you have solidly got those marks. So dedicate about 5 minutes, if maybe more, to read your work carefully. Some students find it helps to read backwards, so a paragraph at a time backwards, or even sentences backwards, because it slows you down. If you work forwards in the regular way that you would read, sometimes you miss things because your brain expects to see certain words in certain orders. So maybe work backwards if that helps for you. You are checking your spelling, punctuation, and grammar. You're checking your word choices are accurate and effective. So don't just fling in a word because it's helpful or fancy. Use a word because it fits. Check your paragraphs are all accurate. If you don't use paragraphs, I think you're limited about 5 out of 24 for content. You want content and organisation, and you want more than that. You've got to check your overall argument and your ideas and examples are all believable. So everything should all fit together. It should all be interesting. And hopefully you should feel really proud of what you put together because it's a hard question. There's lots to remember. But yes, it's also, don't forget, it's about showing off as well. But yes, that's it. I know there's loads of information, but I hope you found it useful. Yeah, that's it.
Excellent. Yeah, I thought that was a really great lesson. I'm going to take that message on proofreading for some of the stuff I do at work. I need to start proofreading a little bit more on the stuff that I'm putting out, but have that idea of reading backwards. I know when I was at school, I would I'd proofread, and by that I mean I would skim through and go, okay, sure. So yeah, that's really interesting, that sort of going backwards. Yeah, I'm going to apply that to myself. So I'd urge other students out there to do that as well. Um, Unfortunately, we don't have any questions in the chat, but
Mhm.
I've got one actually for you, and it's just going to be: do you have any tips for students that, obviously the English exam is a very, or this exam is a very long exam. I remember it well.
Mhm.
Do you have any tips for managing that time effectively? I was a massive overthinker, and I would write incredibly slowly. So do you have any tips for students that would experience the same thing as me and maybe not use the time, or use the time too well, let's say, and not finish everything?
Absolutely, I was definitely the same. I would happily write 14 pages if I was allowed to. My advice would be, before you start, you don't pick up your pen for about 30 seconds, which sounds odd, but it slows your brain down first of all. You've got to slow right down, because you've got to be really picky. You've got 45 minutes to show what you can do. So 30 seconds, you sit there, you take some deep breaths, and you look at the statement and you think, what are my best arguments? And you limit yourself to 4 or 5 of those arguments, and you really strictly stick to those. It's not about listing as many arguments as you can think of. It's about listing, 3, 4, 5 arguments that are effective and um, engaging and interesting. Um, so yeah, just being really picky and slowing down and being strict with yourself in how many points you make.
Excellent.
I think that's
And also the bit. Do you get marked on how neat your handwriting is, or is that a proper myth?
it's definitely a myth, but it has to be legible. So if the examiner can't read what you've written, then they can't reward you for what you've written. So as long as it's neat enough, and as long as it's clear what your punctuation is. So for example, if you are someone who does a full stop but it looks a bit like a comma, you don't want to be dragged down like that. So yeah, you don't get marks for your handwriting. My handwriting's rubbish, but as long as you can read it, it's all fine.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you very much for that, Hannah. Really appreciate it. Your second one, so
Yeah.
building up that content library on Sherpa.
Mhm.
Hopefully we can get you back for another one, because these are really great. If you're looking to have some tuition sessions with Hannah, her link is in the description below of this YouTube video. It should be nice at the top. So if you do want to check out Hannah's profile on Sherpa and inquire about tuition sessions with her, you can through that link. Alternatively, if you're looking for another tutor in maybe maths or physics or whatever it may be, head onto the Sherpa website. We've got tutors, thousands of tutors in all different subjects. So have a look, see if there's a tutor that's right for you, or alternatively, give one of our tutor experts a call on 01628 337 590. But yeah, thanks again, Hannah. It was brilliant. And cheers, everyone. Bye.
Thank you.